Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this program, another program which we call From the YIVO Archives. And in this case, the title is From the YIVO Archives, If Books Could Talk, the story of three Jewish treasures rescued from the Vilna Ghetto. This is a Ruth Gay seminar in Jewish studies, and Professor David Fishman is going to be our speaker this evening. I want to begin by thanking the family of Ruth Gay, and I want to acknowledge Shirley Gorenstein, who is with us this evening, for their continuing generosity of the family and for really enabling us through their gift to make it possible to present public lectures like this that are devoted specifically to the treasures of the YIVO archives. Real thanks, however, for this idea goes to Fruma Moore, the senior archivist at YIVO, who realized the need for this, who spoke with the Gay family and effectuated this wonderful gift. So, Fruma, you deserve everyone's thanks. I also want to acknowledge and to thank the Nathan Ruderman Foundation and the Claims Conference, both for providing funds for the ongoing grant to digitize and microfilm the Sutzkever Kaczerginski collection of literary and historical manuscripts, which was saved in the Vilna Ghetto by Avraham Sutzkever and is the subject of tonight's talk. The microfilming and digitization have been completed with their support. And Florence Ruderman, who is with us this evening, is the head of the Nathan Ruderman Foundation, and I wish to say how grateful we are for your generosity, and not only your generosity, but your constant attention to the project, which has spurred on the work of the project. So thank you. The Herzl Diary and the Register of the Vilna Gaon Synagogue, which will be spoken about tonight, are part of the Sutzkever Kaczerginski collection here at YIVO. The third archival document, which will be discussed this evening, is an original manuscript of Jacob Gordin's classic Yiddish play Mirele Efros, which we discovered in a box of unsorted materials as we were doing a survey of materials in Vilnius. There are still several boxes, and I don't know exactly how many there are, but it's substantial, of materials in Vilnius, of the Vilna, what we call the Vilna collection of materials, that is to say YIVO's pre-war collection of archives and documents, a substantial portion of which was stolen by the Nazis, and this is going to be also part of Professor Fishman's lecture this evening, that have remained in Vilnius, and part is here in New York City. And when we went to Vilnius a year or so ago, we were looking into one of these unsorted boxes, and we found documents that were rolled up still in balls, dirty and crushed. We found manuscripts helter-skelter, all of which is in need of preservation, and much of which is connected to material that we have here in our own archives in New York City. In fact, as Marek Webb has said to me on many occasions, there are often examples of a single document that was literally torn in half. One half we have here, the other half is in Vilnius. And so this project to digitize and to preserve these materials is of the utmost importance. Not that each individual document is of the utmost importance, but that together it is a collective memory of the Jewish people of Eastern Europe. And this is the really, I would say, historical and great project that the YIVO Institute is undertaking now, which is to digitize and preserve the entirety of our collection, to reunite what is in Vilnius with what is here, not physically, but virtually, by creating a digital web portal that will contain all these digital images. And in many cases, we will literally be able to reunite documents that have been kept apart for all of these years, 60 years, 70 years, torn apart by the Einsatzstab Rosenberg. It is a project that will involve millions of dollars. And I am glad to say that as of this moment, the Lithuanian government has proved to be, at least in this instance, not only very welcoming and very agreeable to the project that we have proposed to them, but they have also been forthcoming. And they have agreed to reserve 400,000 euros, approximately $500,000, for the completion of this project in Lithuania. This is a tremendous investment by them, and it is a sign of goodwill, and it is our historical responsibility to seize this opportunity now, when we can, and not let another 60 years go by before these materials are brought back together. Another person in the audience I would like to recognize for her work in helping to recreate the world that was Vilna is Mirele Van Doren, who is with us tonight, who is the head of the Vilna project. And we will be working together with some of your materials as well. So it's a pleasure to have you here. Those of you who wish to learn more about this project to digitize all of our pre-war collections, I invite you to look at our website, to go to our Facebook page, but moreover, I invite you to become a member of YIVO if you are not already a member of YIVO, so that you will be able to take advantage of learning about this project as it is happening. It is a 7-year project. It is a long-term investment, a real commitment to preserving our collective past. And as Yitzhak Arad has recently said in a video that we are going to broadcast for our December 17th dinner, which I invite all of you to come to, the knowledge of this past is the only real security we have for a future. Without a past, the people does not have a future. These materials help us regain that past. All of the materials for joining YIVO are outside, and there will be people there who certainly will be willing to help you. I want to thank all of the staff of the YIVO archives, Fruma Mila Sholachova, the chief archivist and head of the archive and library, Shmuel Klein, who has worked on the Sutzkever Kaczerginski collection, Eddie Goldwasser, who is in charge of the electronic finding aids, the programming and design team, Helena Gindi, who is our program director, Leah Falk, Alex Brandwine, for making this program possible. I'm Jonathan Brent, director of the YIVO Institute, and now it's my real pleasure to invite Professor David Fishman to the podium. Thank you. Just a moment. I forgot to introduce David. He's so well known to all of us. I forgot his bio, but it's crucial. Wow. So, for those of you who don't know who David Fishman is, David is professor of Jewish history at the Jewish Theological Seminary, teaching courses in modern Jewish history. He also serves as director of Project Judaica, a Jewish studies program based in Moscow, Kiev, co-sponsored by JTS and local universities. And I must say, one of the single most important initiatives undertaken to survey the amount of Jewish archival material throughout throughout Russia and former Soviet Union. David Fishman is the author of numerous books and articles on the history and culture of East European Jewry. His books include Russia's First Modern Jews, New York University Press, The Rise of Modern Yiddish Culture, Pittsburgh University Press. Dr. Fishman is co-editor with Burton Vysotsky of From Mesopotamia to Modernity, 10 Introductions to Jewish History and Literature, Westview Press, which also appeared in a revised Russian edition called От Abrama до современности. For 15 years, from 1988 to 2003, Dr. Fishman was editor-in-chief of YIVO Blätter, the Yiddish language scholarly journal of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, now an online publication. More recently, he edited a volume of Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik's Yiddish writings and discourses based on original handwritten manuscripts. David serves on the academic committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and on the editorial boards of Jewish Social Studies and Polin. Dr. Fishman travels frequently to Moscow and other parts of the former Soviet Union. On behalf of Project Judaica, he directs its Jewish archival survey, which locates and describes Jewish archival materials in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Dr. Fishman is now completing a book on the rescue of Vilna's Jewish cultural treasures from the Nazis and Soviets, a topic he first explored in the YIVO published brochure, Embers Plucked from the Fire. Now, David, you may come.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I've spoken about this topic, generally speaking, in many places, but I haven't had, this is my first opportunity to speak at YIVO, and that's very special for me. Most scholars and researchers who work in YIVO's archives are focused on their topic of interest, and they don't give much thought to the biography of the documents that they hold in their hands. But more than most archives, YIVO holds treasures whose very survival is nothing less than miraculous. These documents endured the two most murderous and anti-Semitic regimes of the 20th century, Nazi Germany and late Stalinist Soviet Union. Tonight, I'd like to let three of those documents talk and let them tell their life stories from the beginning to the present, their birth, that is their composition, how they were acquired by YIVO, that is how they became wedded to this institution, their fate under Hitler and Stalin, their immigration to America, or in the case of one of these treasures, its difficult existence being left behind in Soviet Lithuania. These three documents illuminate very different aspects of modern Jewish history and culture. What unites them is the fact that all three were in the Vilna Ghetto and were rescued from destruction. First, I will review very briefly, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, the outline of the story of Vilna's Jewish cultural treasures during and after the war. Vilna, the Jerusalem of Lithuania, had three great repositories on the eve of the war. First, there was the Strashun Library, which housed the finest collection of Hebrew books and periodicals in Eastern Europe, and which belonged to the Vilna Jewish community, to the Kehillah. Second was the Ansky Museum of the Jewish Historical Ethnographic Society, This museum had an impressive collection of Jewish art, artifacts, rare books, and old historical documents, including pinkasim, record books of communities. And third, last but not least, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, YIVO, which had an extraordinary library of Yiddish books and periodicals, and an archive rich in documentation of Jewish life in Eastern Europe, mainly from the late 19th and 20th centuries. When the Germans entered Vilna in late June 1941, they not only began persecuting and murdering its Jews, they also began looting its Jewish collections and shipping select treasures to Germany. In Germany, the Jewish materials were to be exploited by the budding academic field of anti-Semitic Jewish studies, known as Judenforschung. The purpose of Judenforschung was to justify the persecution, ghettoization, extermination of the Jews using the tools of scientific scholarship. In February 1942, the main Nazi German agency charged with looting Jewish cultural property, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the ERR as it's called in brief, set up a working group in Vilna, headed by Dr. Johannes Paul. Paul was a Nazi Judenforschung specialist who had once taken courses at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. The ERR working group seized control of the YIVO building and engaged 20 Jewish slave laborers to sort Jewish cultural treasures into two categories: those materials to be sent to Germany for Judenforschung, and those materials to be sent to their destruction. The contingent of Jewish slave laborers, headed by librarian Hermann Kruk, headed by librarian Hermann Kruk and YIVO scholar Zelig Kalmanovitch. This work contingent was nicknamed by ghetto inmates the Paper Brigade. The members of the Paper Brigade, and most notably the young Yiddish poets who belonged to the Paper Brigade, Avrom Sutzkever and Szmerke Kaczerginski, decided to foil the Germans' designs. They hid thousands of books, manuscripts, and documents from the Germans to prevent both their deportation to Germany and their destruction. Mostly, they concealed the material on their bodies at the end of the workday, and they smuggled the materials back into the ghetto, past the Jewish, Lithuanian, and German guards. Once in the ghetto, the members of the Paper Brigade buried the material in bunkers and hiding places. They handed other materials over to non-Jewish friends for safekeeping. This dangerous operation lasted 1.5 years, until shortly before the liquidation of the Vilna Ghetto in September 1943, when its 15,000 last surviving inmates were sent to labor camps, death camps, and the mass murder site at Ponar. Most members of the Paper Brigade perished, including its leaders, Kruk and Kalmanovitch. But Kaczerginski and Sutzkever survived and returned to Vilna when the city was liberated by the Red Army in July 1944. They dug up the materials from their bunkers and hiding places, and they established an institution to house them, the Vilna Jewish Museum, under the auspices of the Ministry of Culture of the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. The museum was located within the borders of the former Nazi-imposed ghetto, in buildings that had previously been the ghetto library, the ghetto prison, and the ghetto bathhouse. This institution amassed tens of thousands of Jewish books, manuscripts, documents, many of which were piled in mountains in the courtyard. But within 1 year after Vilna's liberation, both Sutzkever and Kaczerginski came to lose all faith that there was a future for Jewish life in Soviet Vilnius. The authorities refused to allow publication of a Yiddish newspaper, of a magazine or books in Vilna. They refused to permit the creation of a Yiddish theater. The museum had no approved budget. It was briefly closed down, then reopened with a staff of 3 people, plus a secretary and a janitor. One night, the sanitation department removed one of the mountains of treasures that were kept outdoors in the courtyard and destroyed it. Then the KGB visited the museum and told its heads they were forbidden to share its holdings with the public. Kaczerginski, who was the museum's director, realized that the materials had survived extermination at the hands of the Germans, but they were now locked up in a Soviet prison camp. The materials needed to be rescued again. Sutzkever and Kaczerginski left for Poland and arranged to smuggle numerous suitcases across the border, jam-packed with books and documents. After several months in Lodz, they and the documents made their way to Paris. And from Paris, they shipped most of the material in their possession to YIVO in New York in late 1946 and 1947. The Vilnius Jewish Museum continued to function under different leadership after Sutzkever and Kaczerginski left until June 1949, when it was closed down by the Soviet authorities, as were all Jewish cultural institutions in the USSR at that time. The liquidated museum's holdings were given over to several Lithuanian repositories, most notably to the book chamber of the Lithuanian SSR, directed by Antanas Ulpis. After Stalin's death in 1953, Ulpis arranged for the Jewish books held by the book chamber to be cataloged. But he kept secret the fact that he also had taken possession of a significant collection of documents, which he hid in one of his storage facilities, a former monastery. Ulpis took that secret to his grave. The existence of the trove of documents was discovered in 1988 during a cleanup of the facility. That, in bare bones, is the collective history of thousands of items found today in the YIVO Library and Archives in New York and in the Lithuanian National Library in Vilnius and the Central State Archives of Lithuania in Vilnius. The full story will be in my book. The 3 documents whose individual biographies I want to tell you now, all shared in this history to a greater or lesser extent, but each had its unique fate. Theodor Herzl's diary. YIVO purchased this plum acquisition in 1931, almost by happenstance. Herzl's handwritten notebook covered the years between 1882 and 1887, when he was a law student and a struggling writer in Vienna, a full decade before he founded the Zionist movement. The diary was discovered in the estate of Herzl's wayward son, Hans Herzl, whose life ended in suicide in 1930. Hans was a 13-year-old boy at the time of his father's death in 1904. The scene of that youngster reciting Kaddish at Herzl's gravesite left an indelible impression on all who attended or read about the enormous Herzl funeral. Hans was raised in England, attended Cambridge University, but he was unable to find his place in life. He resented being known only as Theodor Herzl's son, and he was haunted by a sense of failure. He fell into depression and he fell into debt. In 1924, at age 33, Hans Herzl converted to the Baptist Church in order, he said, to establish his independence from his father. He later converted to Catholicism. The Zionist movement and the British Jewish community dissociated themselves from Hans and cut off all ties. He was lonely, impoverished, embittered, and desperate. Hans's sister, Pauline, Herzl's daughter, one of his daughters, was his last anchor in life. Then Pauline fell ill and died, and on the day of his funeral, Hans committed suicide. Hans Herzl stipulated in his will that his father's diary should be sold for a price of a few dozen pounds, and that the proceeds be used to pay off one of his debts. The executor of the Hans Herzl will was the Anglo-Jewish journalist Joseph Leftwich, one of the few members of the Jewish community who stayed in touch with him. Leftwich was also an avid reader of Yiddish literature and a friend of YIVO. He later went on to become a translator and an anthologist of Yiddish literature. As it happens, one of YIVO's leaders, Zalman Reisen, passed through London shortly after Hans's suicide, on his way back to Vilna from a fundraising tour in the United States. Reisen met with Leftwich, and Leftwich told him about the diary. Reisen jumped out of his seat and exclaimed, "This manuscript must belong to YIVO." He offered to purchase it immediately on the spot at the price specified in Hans's will, and he didn't even bother to consult with his colleagues back in Vilna. Leftwich agreed, Reisen paid cash, and took the Herzl diary back to Vilna in his coat pocket. Then controversy erupted. Zionist leaders in Vienna were outraged that the diary had fallen into the hands of a Yiddishist organization whose heads were cool or even hostile towards their movement. They wrote letters to YIVO claiming that Hans Herzl did not have the right to sell his father's diary. The notebook belonged to Theodor Herzl's literary estate, which was supervised by Moritz Reichenfeld, the director of the Vienna Union Bank. The Vienna Zionists threatened to sue YIVO in a court of law, but YIVO refused to give up its acquisition unless a court of law would order it to do so. After threats did not yield the intended results, the central offices of the Zionist movement in Vienna resorted to diplomacy. They asked local Zionists in Vilna to meet with YIVO heads Max Weinreich and Zalman Reisen and use their power of persuasion. The Vilna Zionists, led by Jacob Gordin, argued to YIVO's leaders it was preferable for all of Herzl's diaries to be located in one place. The notebook should be united with the other Herzl diaries held by the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. They also suggested that Theodor Herzl wasn't really a topic related to YIVO's area of scholarship. The Vilna Zionists presumably also offered a sum of money to compensate YIVO for its expenses and perhaps also to sweeten the pot. But YIVO responded that all Jewish affairs, including Theodor Herzl, were of interest to the Institute. Reisen didn't hide the fact that YIVO considered possession of the diary a matter of institutional prestige. It put YIVO on the map of major Jewish repositories. After 1.5 years of intermittent meetings, the Zionists gave up. The diary itself was something of a bombshell. It revealed just how assimilated and indeed assimilationist Herzl had been in his younger years. The future father of the Jewish state considered himself to be a German. After reading Eugene Düring's anti-Semitic treatise, The Jewish Question as a Question of Racial Damage, the young Viennese law student concluded that Jews must blend into the majority society as fully as possible. Quote, "The blending of the Western races with the so-called Eastern races on the basis of common civil religion, that is the desired solution." The Herzl that emerged from the pages of this diary was an insecure young man, especially when you compared him to the regal and domineering leader of the Zionist movement a decade later. I quote, "I am not one of those who will attain a visible position among the great minds of our time. I do not have any illusions about myself," he brooded. "Today I am 22 years old, and I have accomplished close to nothing. Without denying my talent, I feel I do not have a great book in me." In fact, the mood and emotions expressed in certain passages were quite similar to the moods and emotions later felt by his son Hans. He said, I quote again from an April 1883 entry, "There is no love in my heart, no yearning in my soul, no hope, no joy." The diary deflated the image of the man who became a myth and a legend. The man who had coined the slogan, "If you want it, it is not a fantasy," Im tirtzu ein zu agada, wrote that he had no yearning in his soul. The leader of the movement, whose anthem was Hatikva, the hope, said that he had no hope. When YIVO's Max Weinreich offered to publish a Yiddish translation of the diary in the New York Yiddish Daily, the forward, the Vorwärts, its editor, Abraham Kahn, demurred. Kahn, a long-standing socialist, had become a supporter of labor Zionism after his 1925 visit to Palestine. And the Herzl of the diary was not the Herzl that Kahn wanted his readers to know about. Sutzkever found the diary in the YIVO building in April 1942, just a few weeks after he started working in the paper brigade. It was lying in a pile of valuable items slated for shipment to Germany. He smuggled it into the ghetto and buried it in a cellar at 6 Shavel Street. And it would lie there at 6 Shavel Street underneath the ground of Jewish Vilna for the next 2 years and 3 months. The Herzl diary was uncovered by the Kaczerginski and Sutzkever retrieval team in late August 1944. In September 1944, the newly formed Jewish Museum, Vilna Jewish Museum, prepared the draft text of a promotional brochure to announce its existence to the world. And the brochure proudly listed the treasures that its volunteers and staff had discovered. But nowhere did the brochure mention one of its greatest discoveries, the diary of Theodor Herzl. The Vilna Jewish Museum was a state institution in Soviet Lithuania. And in the Soviet Union, possessing a document written by the founder of political Zionism wasn't something to publicize, let alone boast about. A month later, October 1944, one of the museum's leaders, the former ghetto fighter Abba Kovner, was preparing to leave for Palestine, for Eretz Yisrael. In anticipation of his planned departure, Kovner began to remove select documents from the museum's collection in order to take them with him to the land of Israel. Kovner set his eyes on Herzl's diary, but he failed to remove it. Kaczerginski, then the museum's director, noticed Kovner's wandering eyes and transferred the diary into his office. Kaczerginski was furious at the time that a staff member of the museum would try to steal material from its collection for removal abroad. Little did Kaczerginski know that he would reach the same conclusion as Kovner a year later, and that he would engage in exactly the same activity. When the Herzl diary finally reached YIVO in New York in 1947, the Institute did not make a big splash about the event. In keeping with its aloofness from Zionism, the YIVO newsletter, Yediyos von YIVO, published an article announcing that the Institute had recently acquired 3 valuable diaries by Theodor Herzl, Zelig Kalmanovitch, and Hermann Kruk. The second story, the Pincus, the notebook of the Vilna Gaon synagogue. This gem, the record book of the Klois, or private synagogue of the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Elijah of Vilna, born in 1720 and died in 1797. This item had not belonged to YIVO before the war. It belonged to the Klois, which was an active, functioning synagogue until June 1941. The Gaon's Klois was the place where the reclusive Rabbi Elijah studied and prayed with a group of his disciples. It was located in a residential building where the Gaon lived And participation in his minyan, in his prayer group, was by invitation only. After Rabbi Eliyahu's death in 1797, his disciples continued to study and pray there, and they received a monthly stipend from the Vilna Jewish community to engage in their Talmudic studies. Later, after the Gaon's disciples died out, the wardens of the Kloids would select the Talmudists who would receive a permanent seat there and who would obtain the modest stipend. Eventually, in the mid-19th century, the Kloids opened itself to the public. The space was renovated, expanded in 1856. The Gaon's Kloids stood on the left-hand side of the Schulhof, the synagogue courtyard, just across from the Vilna's great synagogue. You can see here the big building on the right is the great synagogue. In front of it, the lower building is the Strashun Library, and to the left, the building in which was located the Gaon's Kloids. While the great synagogue, the Stotzschul, held seats for over 1,000 people and was exquisitely decorated with marble pillars and an engraved wooden bima, it was with the much smaller Vilna Gaon's Kloids that was the sanctum sanctorum, the holy of holies of Jewish Vilna. Librarian Jacob Gordin offered the following description. The place evokes fear and awe. When you enter and see the gray-bearded Talmudists, it seems as if the spirit of the Gaon still hovers in the air. A Yiddish language tour guide published in 1939 concurred, quote, "The Gaon's Kloids is the gem and the crown of the Jerusalem of Lithuania." Because it was originally a closed congregation for a select group of Talmudists, the Gaon's Kloids did not have a women's section. In that respect, it was unlike any other synagogue in Vilna. The wives and daughters of its regular congregants prayed at home or elsewhere. The services were also peculiar. They followed a set of liturgical practices established by the Gaon himself that differed from the established East European rite. The sequence of psalms was slightly different. Certain Hebrew words were pronounced differently. One sat rather than stood at certain prayers, and so on. The focal point of the Gaon's Kloids was the plaque along the southern wall, which marked the spot where, according to tradition, Rabbi Elijah sat and studied Torah for 40 years. The text, written in very poetic Hebrew, opened with the words, "We saw and found with our own eyes a perfectly righteous man. No human being can adequately recount his praises." Over the spot where the Gaon had studied, there hung an eternal light, an Ner Tamid, an object usually reserved for one place in the synagogue above the Aron HaKodesh, above the Holy Ark. This synagogue had two eternal lights, one over the Ark and one over the place of the Gaon. Underneath that plaque, the wall protruded out in a rectangular shape of a lectern or a pulpit that covered the spot where the Gaon had studied. That shape, that rectangular shape, served both as a monument to the Gaon and as a barrier that prevented anyone from sitting in the place of the Gaon. This is a fuller diagram of all the buildings in the Schulhof, in the synagogue courtyard. The record book of the Gaon's Kloids is a large, thick-bound folio. Looks like a volume of the Talmud. It contains handwritten entries that span between the years 1757 and 1922. It's written in Hebrew, in ornate lettering, as you can see on the left-hand side. Most of the entries, however, are quite routine. They record donations of money and real property, repairs to the facility, the elections of new wardens, the award of seats, and so on. Like all synagogues and kloisen in Vilna, this one was subordinate to the authority of the Kahal, the Jewish communal board, in the 18th and early 19th century. One of the first entries in the record book from 1768 was a decision of the Vilna Kahal authorizing the owners of the building to hold services there on weekdays, Sabbaths, and holidays. The authorization was contingent upon the Gaon continuing to live in the building and study there. The Minute Book's last entry from 1922 recorded for posterity that the Vilna Gaon's mausoleum at the Old Jewish Cemetery had recently been repaired and expanded. The mausoleum had been in ruins. It had been destroyed by Polish legionnaires in a pogrom that they perpetrated in Vilna in April 1919. The Pinkas of the Vilna Gaon's clois had a peaceful pre-war history. It remained in the clois, kept under lock and key by the shamas. Nothing was recorded in it after 1922. Historians occasionally examined the old folio and referred to it in their studies. The Ansky Museum of the Jewish Historical Ethnographic Society, which collected such minute books, expressed an interest in acquiring it, but the wardens of the clois refused. They held on to it. Just how and when the paper brigade smuggled this folio into the ghetto is not known. According to Sutzkever, it was transferred to a secure hiding place at 8 Strashun Street in August 1943, shortly before the ghetto's liquidation, in anticipation of the ghetto's imminent liquidation. The Pinkas was excavated 11 months later, in July 1944. Sutzkever smuggled it out of Vilnius in May 1946, and it accompanied him, Sutzkever, throughout his wanderings across Europe, from Vilnius to Lodz, from Lodz to Paris. Sutzkever was reluctant to part with the item. Upon arrival in Paris in October 1946, he promised to hand it over to YIVO's Paris representative, Gershon Epstein. But a half year later, he still hadn't done it. Since the clois itself was in ruins after the war, the Pinkas was the last important relic of the old Jerusalem of Lithuania. Max Reinrach wrote several times to Sutzkever, reminding him of his promise to hand over the record book. Sutzkever finally parted with the folio shortly before leaving for Palestine. Before he relinquished it, Sutzkever did something which violated all the rules of manuscript preservation. He wrote his own inscription on his first open page, and he signed his name. Even while giving it up, Sutzkever wanted to lay claim to the Pinkas of the Vilna Gaon's clois for all eternity. Gershon Epstein, YIVO's representative in Paris, usually sent packages of the materials he obtained from Sutzkever and from other people by surface mail to YIVO in New York. But Weinreich instructed him that this item was different. Send the Pinkas by airmail, registered, and pack it well with cardboard. I don't care if postage costs $2. $2 then was a lot of money. You know, a stamp was 3 cents back then. The Pinkas is a symbol of Vilna. No matter how stingy we ought to be, most of the time, the Pinkas must be sent by airmail. Third story, Mirele Efros. We now turn to a document that has never left Vilna since YIVO acquired it about 85 years ago. It is a script of Jacob Gordin's classic Yiddish drama, Mirele Efros, held by the Lithuanian Central State Archive. The play script was discovered just last year by YIVO staff members, by senior staff members Roberta Newman and Lyudmila Sholochova while they were surveying uncatalogued Jewish materials in the archive, and I'd like to thank Robbie for sharing this photograph. On the lower left-hand corner of the page, there's a red stamp with the words YIVO, Theater Musee, and an accession number. YIVO's Esther Rochel Kaminsky Theater Museum was established in 1927 a year after the death of the legendary actress Esther Rochel, who was called the mother of Yiddish theater. At the core of this theater museum's rich collection of documents and memorabilia was the Kaminsky family collection. Esther Rochel's husband, Avram Kaminsky, was the director and impresario of the first standing Yiddish theater company in Warsaw, in which she, Esther Rochel, was the lead actress. YIVO's Theater Museum collection was subsequently enriched by a steady flow of donations of material from the Yiddish Actors Union in Warsaw, and also gifts from individual actors. The museum displayed 400 of its items in a permanent exhibition which was located on the second floor of the YIVO building. But thousands upon thousands of other items were held in drawers and closets. Photographs, posters, playbills, scripts, costumes, letters and memoirs by actors, reviews by theater critics, and so on. This item was one of the play scripts. It says in German, Mirele Efros, a picture of life in 4 acts for the German stage by Genfer. Approved, then it says after that in Russian, approved by the Russian Theater Censorship Bureau in St. Petersburg on May 18, 1906. Packed into these few lines is a wealth of theater history. Yiddish theater was banned in Tsarist Russia by the imperial authorities in 1883. While the reasons for that ban are still debated today by historians, it was in effect and widely enforced for 22 years until 1905. Because of the ban, the father of Yiddish theater, Avram Goldfaden, and many other great names of the Yiddish stage left Russia for the United States. Yiddish theater flourished in America while it was outlawed in Russia. Playwright Jacob Gordin penned Mirele Efros in New York in 1898, where it became an epic-making hit and an instant classic. But Mirele Efros was not performed in the old country, in Russia, until 1906, when enforcement of the ban was relaxed. During the 22 years of illegality, Yiddish theater companies tried to pass themselves off as German theater troupes. They submitted German scripts to the drama censors, and they applied to the local police, wherever they wanted to perform, for a permit to perform in German. The actual performance on the stage was in a language that hovered somewhere between German and Yiddish. If the language on the stage gravitated too close to Yiddish and deviated from the German script, the police would close down the show in the middle of the first act. If, on the other hand, the language gravitated too close to German, the audience wouldn't understand and would leave the show in the middle of the first act. And in the larger cities of the Pale of Settlement, cities such as Vilna, Bialystok, Minsk, and Kiev, police officials wouldn't even go along with the ruse that these were German plays. In those cities, Yiddish theater was not performed at all for those 22 years. Wandering troupes performed mainly in small shtetl. But beginning in 1905, the year of the short-lived Russian Revolution, the police authorities in most cities began to allow Yiddish performances. They didn't enforce the rule that German be spoken on the stage. And new life was blown into the struggling body of the Yiddish theater in Russia. An explosion of activity on the Yiddish stage ensued, especially in the big cities where there had been no Yiddish theater. Writers, journalists, critics all hailed this relaxation as a major event, not only for the theater, for Yiddish theater, but for Jewish cultural rights in Russia. The main beneficiary was Yiddish drama. In the bigger cities, Jewish audiences were more sophisticated than in the shtetl. They had been exposed to Polish and Russian theater. and this exposure affected their artistic sensibilities and expectations. A sizable part of the Yiddish theater-going public wanted serious, realistic drama that dealt with real-life problems, not just operettas that were set in antiquity, such as Goldfaden's Bar Kochba or Shulamis, and not just satirical comedies such as Goldfaden's The Two Kunilemels. They wanted the kind of plays that Jacob Gordin had been writing. But while Yiddish could be spoken on the stage, the system of pre-performance censorship did not change. The Theater Censorship Bureau in St. Petersburg didn't have any Jews on staff. It didn't even have Jewish converts to Christianity who could read Yiddish. So the Censorship Bureau required that the scripts of Jewish plays continue to be submitted in German. Hence, this play script of Mirele Efros in German from 1906, subtitled quite absurdly, A Picture of Life for the German Stage. Two impresarios jumped at the newly created opportunity after 1905 to stage Mirele Efros. One was a now forgotten entrepreneur called Solomon Genfer, who back in the days of the band led a company which is reported to have been a cut above the others as far as the quality of acting, repertoire, and stage equipment. Genfer's other claim to fame was his ability to sell tickets at low prices and still turn a profit. Genfer wasn't the author. He was the applicant who submitted this German play script. But once the script had been approved by the censors, Kaczerginski took advantage of the permit to stage the drama in Warsaw, at first starring an actress named Manya Trilling, but then handing the role over to his wife, Esther Rochel Kaczerginski. Mirele Efros was a domestic drama that portrayed the generation break in a well-to-do family in Grodno. On the one hand, there was the noble-hearted, wealthy widow and mater familias, Mirele. On the other hand, there was her greedy, petty, and power-hungry daughter-in-law, Shendel. Caught in the middle was Mirele's feeble and impassive son, Yossele. Performances began in 1906, in the middle of the post-revolutionary excitement in Russian Jewish life. But Mirele Efros was an apolitical bourgeois drama. It was perfectly suited for the period of reaction in Russia that set in 1907. The drama was a smash hit among the sophisticated urban audience. A young theater critic in Warsaw, a future scholar, Noach Prelutsky, was effusive. Mirele Efros is an artistic pearl because she, Mirele, is cut in unusually clean, refined, spiritual, and aristocratic lines. Only an age-old people could produce such a beautiful and deeply human spirit. Mirele represents an epic in our way of life. She embodies the finest features of the old formation of Jewish life in Russia, a formation which has almost died out, but which is still expiring in the distant corners of the provinces. End quote. In 1908, Kaczerginski's theater performed Mirele Efros in the capital city, in St. Petersburg. Russian, non-Jewish critics discovered Yiddish theater as a serious dramatic endeavor, and they hailed Esther Rochel Kaczerginski as a great talent equal to any other on the European stage. Now, we do not have exact information on when the members of the Paper Brigade rescued this manuscript from the Germans, but I'm quite confident that credit is owed to Uma Olknitska, who was the pre-war curator of the YIVO Theater Museum. Olknitska worked in the Paper Brigade, where she sorted the theater museum collection for the Germans, and she handed over many of its items to her colleagues and friends, Sutzkever and Kaczerginski, to smuggle them into the ghetto. Olknitska was also a graphic artist. and the creator of YIVO's logo. She perished in Treblinka. But as a result of her work, the post-war Vilna Jewish Museum had a rich collection of theater material. When Solomon Michoels, the director of the Moscow State Jewish Theater, visited the Vilnius Jewish Museum in 1945, he was astounded by its theater holdings. But when the time came to smuggle parts of the Jewish Museum treasures out of the Soviet Union, Sutzkever and Kaczerginski left this item behind. Sorry. Let me get back. Left this item behind. As writers who cherish the creative written word, Sutzkever and Kaczerginski favored literary manuscripts over other types of materials, playbills, posters, photographs, and in their triage over what to take along in their suitcases, a mediocre German translation of Gordin's play, written in order to obtain a permit from the Russian censors, just did not make the cut. If it had been an original Jacob Gordin manuscript, they would surely have smuggled it out. The play script has lied untouched in Lithuanian repositories since 1949, and it was only discovered last year. It still awaits analysis. We cannot say whether there is a full translation or an abbreviated adaptation, whether it's an authorized script or a pirated script at this moment. Kaczerginski, in his memoir of his Soviet years, Zwischen Hammer und Serb, recalled the moment of realization that whatever treasures would stay behind in Soviet Vilnius would never be accessible to the Jewish world. He was right. He was right for 65 years. From 1949 to 2014, this manuscript was lost, unknown, untouched. But now, thanks to YIVO's Vilna project, there is hope that documents such as this one will receive the attention and the care that they deserve. We cannot make up for lost time, for the decades of neglect and decay while lying in a monastery. But we can make sure that documents such as this one enjoy their old age in the company of friends. Mirele Efros, the play, ends with a family reunion and reconciliation when Mirele attends her grandson's bar mitzvah celebration after years of estrangement between her and her children. In her final lines, Mirele quotes a Yiddish proverb, "Wenn freit sich an eure Mann, wenn gefindt das, was hat verloren." When does a poor Jew rejoice? When he finds the thing that he lost. In that sense, the Vilna Project will give YIVO and Jewish scholarship at large many opportunities for joy and celebration. Thank you.
So if anyone has any questions, I'll be coming around.
Thank you very much for that wonderful and inspiring talk. You mentioned, naturally, there are some threads that you pulled which you didn't get to, and I guess your book goes into, but so I'll just pull at one of the threads, or two of them really. You mentioned at the beginning these other archives, which were in Vilna, the Hebrew Library, I think you mentioned, and then you also mentioned the Ansky ethnographic collection. But I don't think you told us what were the fate of those. And also, one other question, a third question along the same line is, what happened, I think I know, but just to make sure, I mean, what happened to the collections that the Germans actually took with them, and what was the fate of those? So those three archives, thank you.
Sure. I'll be brief. the fate of all the archives is exactly the same. In other words, all these collections were, sorted in the YIVO building between destruction and deportation to Germany. There was no distinction made. The YIVO building was just the place where this work went on. So Strashun books and the Ansky Museum, all of it went through the same process. I'll leave it at that. The second thing, you know the answer, I'm sure, which is, well, it's actually a little more complicated than people think. Most of the material that was sent to Germany was eventually returned to YIVO in New York. That is, Frankfurt, where it was sent, ended up being in the American-occupied zone of Germany. So it was a decision to be made by the American military authorities. And the American authorities decided that YIVO New York was a direct continuation of YIVO Vilna, and they sent whatever they found to here, to New York, received in 1947. I said most, the only thing I'll add that's new, but you may not, people don't know, is most because a lot of what was held in Frankfurt was destroyed in Allied bombing of Frankfurt. There was a lot of Allied bombing of Frankfurt in the first half of 1945, and including the Judaica collections, a lot of it was destroyed. Not intentionally, but by the war. Right.
Does anyone else have any questions?
You talked a lot about the Russian censors of Yiddish Jewish writers, but there was a flowering in the 1920s, a softening, I guess that's pre-Stalin, of the film industry between Germany and Russia. For example, The Girl with the Red Hat, or The Woman with the Red Hat, I forgot the title, that was written by Jewish writers in Germany. It was a Russian film. There was a lot of cross-pollination in the 1920s, before the hardening of, I guess, the late 30s. So did YIVO gather any stuff with films?
Ooh. Did YIVO collect films? I really, we've got archivists here in the audience who know more about that than I do. I imagine YIVO, pre-war YIVO had some film material, but photographic material, of course, very rich. But I really don't know. We'd need to ask our archivists here whether YIVO collected films in any systematic way. When I don't know, I say I don't know.
Mark.
Yeah, I don't know of any mention, any record of films being secured by the YIVO archives in Vilna, as opposed to photographs, as you mentioned. I guess, no, not I don't guess, I'm sure that all those films that are now in our possession, they are a post-war accessions. All of them acquired here in the United States. I don't even know of a single film that we got from overseas, from outside of the United States. Thank you.
Okay.
This Vilna project, are there things that you think are there and that you're going to be looking for?
What I mainly, of course, you can't really predict everything that's there. What you can be sure is there is what Jonathan Brent said, which is these divided archival collections. In other words, including I'm sure there'll be a lot from the Theater Museum. In other words, all the types of material that YIVO has in New York is there. But I think, in general, Sutzkever and Kaczerginski had a good sense of what was valuable, and that they probably took out, the little gems. You understand that an archival collection can't be transported. It's just too voluminous. A manuscript's an easy thing to, but archives get accumulated over decades by institutions that have staffs of 10, 20, 30 people. There's just no way on earth. And how do you pick which letter or which memo, right? So besides the fact that they were writers and preferred literature to anything else, the other fact was simply technical. How do you take out an archival collection? Letters. And so I imagine what will be in what there is in Vilna is more archival and not particularly literary, because I think the literary manuscripts they took out in 1946. But beyond that, we really need the project to see. And it's really very important. I mean, this has been lying there for 65 years. And now there's the opportunity. It would, those people who, like Uma Olkanitska, who perished while they were dealing with this material and trying to save it, we owe it to them to put it in order, to make it accessible.
Any last questions? Okay.
I wonder if you could sort out the Hans Herzl question in terms of possession of the diary or ownership of the diary. What was the dispute?
What? Well, I'm not a lawyer.
Okay.
And I'm not a, intellectual property lawyer. I know what they said, but the Zionist organization said this didn't belong to Hans Herzl. It belongs to Theodor Herzl. Hans Herzl didn't have the right to bequeath it. All I can tell you is if that were a very strong legal argument, the Zionist organization in Vienna would have gone to court, right, to get it back. The fact that it didn't go to court to get it back tells me that that argument would not have held up in a court of law. The father left it to his son. The son inherited it, and the son had every right to bequeath it as he saw fit.
David, there is a story, and I suppose you can let us know whether it's apocryphal or not, that when the diary was put up for sale, Max Weinreich had put aside money for an operation to cure his blindness in one eye. Instead of using the money for his operation, he rather used it to buy the diary. Is this, what do you know about that?
First of all, I just heard this story tonight from Fruma before the program. All I can tell you is everything that Zalman Reisen wrote about this incident, after all, he was the person who got it, and that Max Weinreich himself wrote about this, makes no mention of anything of that kind. And in fact, it doesn't seem to make sense because the Reisen describes, that this was a spur-of-the-moment thing. Literally, he took his own money out of his pocket and said, I'm buying it. He had money he'd raised in America, and he just spent it. He said, I'm buying it. There was no consultation. So it sounds to me apocryphal, but I will try to explore it further. What year? Yes, of course Max Weinreich lost his eye. I was trying to remember what is the year of that attack on Max Weinreich.
During those anti-Semitic
Yeah, of course, but there were many, Marek. That doesn't date it. You understand? If the attack was after 1931, if it was 1932, then the story doesn't hold any water because this was acquired in 1931. And I'll check, was in Weinreich's biography to see, when did he lose his vision in the eye?
Hoi Chemes.
I think when I read the report that Weinreich wrote up, it's the version that I read, which is perhaps different from other versions, is that Raisin brought the diary to Vilna, and then they were asked to pay up, and it was sort of given to him sort of like almost on contingency, and that they paid up in Vilna. That's the version that I read.
So then it's very possible
I
that
read
the
that
money
version.
was intended. Okay, I've got to check that out. Thank you.
On that note, please join me in thanking Professor Fishman.
Thank you.
Have a great night.